Welcome, fellow traveller. Now, we begin a journey through the complete history of football, from the ancient civilizations that first discovered the simple joy of kicking a ball to the stadiums, legends, and unforgettable moments that made it the most loved sport on Earth. We will travel across centuries and continents, from the military fields of ancient China to the crowded streets of medieval England, from the first written rules and working-class clubs to the birth of the World Cup. We will meet the players who transformed the game into art, witness the matches that became part of our shared memory, and follow football as it grew from a simple pastime into a global language spoken by billions. This is a story of victory and heartbreak, of communities, rivalries, dreams, and belonging. A story shaped not only by the greatest players, but by every child who has ever placed a ball at their feet and imagined a roaring crowd. So settle in, breathe deeply, and allow the world around you to grow quiet. Our journey begins long before the stadium lights, in a world where football had no name, no rules, and no idea of what it would one day become. This is the complete history of football, the beautiful game. Before football, ancient ball games across the world. There is something so natural about kicking a ball that it may be one of the oldest human impulses there is. Long before anyone thought to codify it, long before there were referees or goalposts or offside rules, human beings were kicking things: rocks, skulls, bundles of cloth, inflated animal bladders, anything round enough to move with satisfying unpredictability when struck. The earliest organized ball game we know of was played in China sometime around 300 BC, possibly earlier. It was called cuju, which translates roughly as kick the ball. The rules were simple enough. Get the ball through a small hole in a silken net stretched between two bamboo poles. No hands. The feet only. Cuju was played by soldiers as a form of training. The Han Dynasty military manuals describe it as a useful exercise for developing footwork and coordination. But it quickly became something much more than that. By the time of the Tang Dynasty, around 600 AD, cuju had become a sophisticated court entertainment. Professional players were employed, tournaments were held, and in some of the most affecting images from this period, the players depicted on the silk scrolls and ceramic figurines are not soldiers but women, ladies of the imperial court in flowing silk robes, playing cuju in palace gardens while the emperor watched. The oldest known football rulebook in the world is not English, it is Chinese. A document from the Han Dynasty, dating to approximately 50 BC, describes the rules of cuju with considerable precision. The dimensions of the field, the number of players, the requirement to use only the feet. The Football Association, which is universally credited with inventing the rules of modern football, was founded in 1863 AD. The Chinese were playing an organized ball game with written rules nearly 2,000 years earlier. FIFA officially recognized cuju as the earliest form of football in 2004. When the Chinese national team plays at a World Cup, they are, in a very real sense, the inventors of the sport coming home. Cuju was not alone. On the other side of the world, the Mesoamerican civilizations, the Olmecs, the Maya, the Aztecs, were playing their own ball games for at least 3,000 years before the Spanish arrived. The Mesoamerican ball game, played in long stone courts with sloping walls, used a solid rubber ball, the first rubber ball in history, that could only be struck with the hips, knees, and elbows, never the hands, never the feet either, which distinguishes it from football proper. But the essential idea, a ball, a court, opponents, a goal, is unmistakably there. The ball courts of the ancient Maya are among the most evocative spaces in the Americas. Some of them are enormous. The Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza is 168 meters long, larger than an American football field. The stone rings through which the rubber ball had to pass are set vertically in the walls, about 8 meters off the ground. To score was so difficult, and the game so long, that some scholars believe an entire match might produce only 1 or 2 successful shots. We know that the Mesoamerican ball game had a religious and sometimes sacrificial dimension. Depictions of decapitation are found on the walls of some ball courts, though scholars debate whether it was the winner or the loser who was sacrificed, or whether the sacrifice was ritual rather than literal. What is certain is that the game mattered enormously, not just as entertainment, but as cosmology, as a reenactment of the struggle between order and chaos, light and darkness. Football today is sometimes described as a religion. In Mesoamerica, it actually was one. In ancient Greece, a game called episkiros was played with a ball and 2 teams. In Rome, harpastum, a rough, physical team ball game, was played by soldiers and citizens alike. The Romans, who brought their culture to every corner of their empire, may well have carried some version of harpastum to the islands they called Britannia. Whether this is the direct ancestor of English football or simply a parallel development is debated. But the Romans were kicking balls on the fields of Britain 2,000 years ago, which is a thought worth sitting with for a moment. All of these games, cuju, the Mesoamerican ball game, episkiros, harpastum, share something with modern football. They share the ball. They share the contest. They share the deep human pleasure of sending something flying through the air with your body and watching where it lands. The rest, the rules, the clubs, the World Cups, the transfer fees, all of that came much later. The chaotic mob game, medieval football in England. Let us jump forward to medieval England. The year is somewhere around 1300 AD, and in a market town somewhere in the English Midlands, it is Shrove Tuesday. Shrove Tuesday, the day before Lent begins, the last day of excess before 40 days of fasting, was traditionally a holiday, a day of carnival, a day when the normal rules of the town were suspended. And on this particular Shrove Tuesday, as on every Shrove Tuesday for as long as anyone can remember, the young men of the town are playing football, not the football we know. What is happening in the streets of this medieval town would be almost unrecognizable to a modern spectator. There are no goalposts in the conventional sense. The goals might be 2 mills on opposite sides of town, a mile apart. There are no defined teams. It might be the married men against the unmarried, or one parish against another, or simply everyone who shows up. There are no boundaries. The game is played through the streets, across fields, through streams, into shops and houses and occasionally churches. There are no referees. There are virtually no rules at all. The ball, a pig's bladder, inflated and sewn into leather, is placed in the centre of town at noon. And then anything goes. It is loud, chaotic, violent, joyful, and almost impossible to stop once it has started. The crowd is simultaneously the players and the spectators. Buildings are damaged, people are injured, and virtually every year someone is killed. The authorities hated it. King Edward II of England issued a royal decree in 1314 banning football in the streets of London, describing it as causing great noise in the city, through the hustling over large balls from which many evils might arise which God forbid. He was not the first. Over the following 3 centuries, football was banned in England no fewer than 30 times by various royal proclamations, parliamentary acts, and civic ordinances. The banning never worked. The people simply ignored it and kept playing. The game was too deeply embedded in the fabric of popular life to be eliminated by royal decree. Which tells you something important about what football was and what it would become. No institution created it. No authority permitted it. It existed because people wanted to play it, and no one, not the king, not parliament, not the church, was powerful enough to make them stop. The medieval mob game had regional variations across the whole of Britain and much of Europe. In Derby, Attercliffe, Kirkwall, in the Orkney Islands, and dozens of other towns, the Shrove Tuesday football match was an annual event of enormous social significance, a ritual as important as any religious festival, a day when the whole community gathered and the young men proved themselves, and old scores were settled and new bonds were formed. It was not just a game, it was a statement about who these people were. By the early 19th century, the mob game was dying out, driven away by urban growth, by the enclosure of common land, by an increasingly organized and regulated society that had less and less tolerance for chaos in the streets. But just as the old popular football was disappearing from the towns, something remarkable was happening behind the high walls of the English public schools. Football was being reinvented. The Cambridge rules, the afternoon schoolboys codified a sport. The English public schools of the early 19th century, Eton, Harrow, Rugby, Winchester, Charterhouse, were peculiar institutions. They were schools for the sons of the aristocracy and the upper middle class, places of classical education and organized brutality in roughly equal measure. The boys lived together in dormitories, ate together in great halls, and spent their afternoons in the school's fields, playing games that had evolved organically over generations with rules particular to each school. The problem was that every school had its own version of football. Eton played a game along a narrow strip beside a wall, the famous Eton Wall game. Harrow played on muddy fields in their top hats. Rugby allowed handling the ball, running with it, and a great deal of violence. Winchester had its own completely idiosyncratic rules. When boys from different schools met, at university for instance, they could not play together because they had no common language. In November 1848, a group of students at Cambridge University gathered on Parker's Piece, a large flat common in the centre of Cambridge, and attempted to solve this problem. They represented different schools with different traditions, and they spent most of an afternoon arguing, compromising, and gradually working toward a set of rules everyone could accept. The result was the Cambridge Rules of 1848, the first serious attempt to create a unified set of football rules that could be used anywhere by anyone. The Cambridge Rules meeting of 1848 lasted approximately 8 hours and was conducted by students, most of whom were between 17 and 20 years old. They had no authority, no institutional backing, no resources beyond a piece of paper and strong opinions. And yet, what they produced that afternoon on Parker's Piece became the direct ancestor of the laws of the game that govern football in every country on earth today. The fundamental principles they established, that you advance the ball by kicking it rather than carrying it, that handling should be restricted or eliminated, that the goal should be defined and agreed upon, are still the principles of the game 175 years later. A group of university students arguing on a common in Cambridge on a November afternoon in 1848 effectively wrote the constitution of the world's most popular sport. The Cambridge rules were not the final word, but they established a direction toward a kicking game rather than a handling game that would prove decisive. Different schools and clubs continued to use their own variations for another 15 years. The chaos continued, but the direction of travel was clear. All that was needed now was an institution to make it official. The Football Association is born. 1863 and the Great Split. On the evening of the 26th of October, 1863, representatives of 11 London football clubs gathered in a pub called the Freemasons' Tavern in Great Queen Street, London. They had come to do what the Cambridge students had attempted 15 years earlier, to agree on a single set of rules for football. The meetings continued over several evenings through October and November. And in those meetings, the central question, the question that would define the future of not one but two sports, was debated with increasing intensity. Should players be allowed to run with the ball in their hands? Should players be allowed to hack, to kick an opponent's shins in order to make them drop the ball? The clubs from the public school tradition of rugby said yes. The clubs that had evolved from the Cambridge tradition said no. The argument grew heated, and eventually, irrevocably, it split. On the 8th of December 1863, the clubs that wanted handling and hacking walked out of the Freemasons' Tavern and went away to form what would eventually become the Rugby Football Union. The clubs that remained agreed on a set of rules that prohibited handling, except by the goalkeeper, and prohibited hacking entirely. The Football Association was founded, the laws of the game were written, and the sport that would one day be played by 250 million people in more than 200 countries had its founding document. The word soccer, which Americans and Australians use for what the rest of the world calls football, is not an American invention. It is English, and it dates to the 1880s. It is a slang abbreviation of association, as in the Football Association, with the ER suffix that Victorian English public school boys applied to everything. Rugby football became rugger. Association football became a soccer, and then simply soccer. The word was widely used in England for decades. It was the English who gave the Americans the word, and then the English stopped using it. The next time someone tells you that calling it soccer is wrong, you can explain that it is, in fact, the original English slang for the game. The Football Association's rules spread quickly. Clubs formed across England, not just in London, but in Sheffield, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Nottingham. The first FA Cup was held in 1871. The Football League, the world's first professional football league, was founded in 1888. By the end of the 19th century, football was no longer a game played by the sons of the English upper class. It had become completely and irrevocably the working man's game. The working man's game, football, leaves the schools and finds the factories. The transformation of football from an elite school sport to a mass working-class phenomenon is one of the most remarkable social stories of the 19th century. And it happened with extraordinary speed. The mechanism was simple. The young men who had learned to play football at public school went out into the world, as army officers, as colonial administrators, as engineers and factory managers. And wherever they went, they brought football with them. They organized clubs among the workers they employed. They set up pitches in the mill towns and the mining villages and the port cities of industrial England. The workers took to it immediately, and then they made it their own. By the 1880s, the great clubs of the English industrial north were being formed. Wolverhampton Wanderers, founded by pupils of a local school. Aston Villa, founded by members of a Wesleyan Chapel cricket club. Blackburn Rovers, formed by grammar school old boys. Bolton Wanderers, Burnley, Sunderland, Preston North End, club after club emerging from the industrial communities of the north, their identity rooted not in the schools, but in the streets and the factories and the churches of their towns. Football gave these communities something they desperately needed: a collective identity, a shared story, a reason to gather on a Saturday afternoon and feel for 90 minutes that the world was organized into something comprehensible. Two sides, one ball, a winner and a loser, and that your side, your town, your people might triumph. The first professional footballer in England, the first person ever paid a wage specifically to play football, was a Scottish player named Fergus Souter, who joined Darwen FC in Lancashire in 1878 after being recruited from Glasgow. The Football Association at the time maintained a strict amateur code. It believed that paying players to play was ungentlemanly and would corrupt the spirit of the game. Souter was paid anyway, quietly, in arrangements that everyone knew about and politely pretended not to notice. By 1885, the FA had given in to reality and legalized professionalism. The very first professional contract in the history of football was a small, slightly embarrassed capitulation to the fact that working men, unlike aristocrats, needed to be paid for their time. The sport has been professional ever since, and the wages have grown somewhat. The clubs that formed in those industrial communities in the 1880s and 1890s are still there. Aston Villa still play in Birmingham. Blackburn Rovers still play in Blackburn. Sunderland, Wolverhampton, Bolton, Burnley, they have been promoted and relegated, and sometimes forgotten, and sometimes celebrated, but they have survived for over 130 years because the communities that created them never stopped caring. That is what a football club is at its deepest level. Not a brand, not a business, not an entertainment product. A community that has decided to have a team. The spread, how football crossed oceans and became a global language. The story of how football spread from England to the world is, in some ways, the story of the British Empire and of British commerce, and of the extraordinary mobility of British workers and sailors and merchants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Wherever British people went, they took football with them. British sailors played it in the ports of Buenos Aires and Montevideo. British engineers played it in the mining camps of Chile and the railways of Brazil. British merchants played it in the trading cities of Europe, in Genoa, in Barcelona, in Amsterdam, in Vienna. British teachers played it in the mission schools of Africa and Asia, and the people they played it with, or near, or against, were captivated by it. The simplicity of the game was the key. You needed almost nothing to play it. A ball, or something ball-shaped, which could be almost anything. A flat piece of ground, some indication of where the goals were. And other people. That was it. No expensive equipment. No complex infrastructure. No literacy required to understand the rules. Football was the most democratic game ever invented, and it spread like water finding its level into every gap, every community, every corner of the world that it reached. Football reached Argentina via British sailors and railway workers in the 1860s and 1870s, and by the early 20th century, the Argentines were playing it with a flair and a technical sophistication that the English who had brought it could barely recognize. The Argentine style, the roulette, the nutmeg, the dribble through impossibly tight spaces, developed in the potreros, the empty lots and scrubby patches of ground in working-class Buenos Aires, where boys played barefoot in small spaces, with the ball always close to their feet because there was no room to kick it long. The potreros produced Alfredo Di Stefano. They produced Diego Maradona. They produced Lionel Messi. Every genius that Argentine football has ever given the world was formed in some essential way by a small piece of ground where there was not enough space to do anything but be brilliant. By 1900, football clubs existed on every continent. By 1904, the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, FIFA, had been founded in Paris with 7 member nations. By 1920, there were 20 member nations. By 1930, there were 41. The game that had begun in the schoolyards of Victorian England had, within 50 years of the founding of the Football Association, become genuinely global, and it was time to settle definitively who was best. The first World Cup, Uruguay 1930. It is July 1930. We are in Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay, a small, prosperous South American nation that had won the football gold medal at the Olympic Games in both 1924 and 1928, and that had offered to pay the travel and accommodation costs of every national team willing to make the journey to South America for the first ever FIFA World Cup. The journey was genuinely considerable. The European teams who came, France, Belgium, Yugoslavia, Romania, arrived by ship, a crossing that took 2 or 3 weeks each way. Several major European nations declined the invitation entirely. England, who had withdrawn from FIFA in a dispute over amateurism, Italy and Spain and Germany and the Netherlands, who considered the journey too long and the competition too uncertain. The tournament that would one day be the most watched sporting event in human history began with 13 teams and an attendance at most games that would not fill a modern lower league ground. And yet, there was something extraordinary in the air in Montevideo that July. The host nation had built a new stadium for the occasion, the Estadio Centenario, 100,000 capacity, named to mark the centenary of Uruguayan independence in just over 2 months of frantic construction. The streets of Montevideo were alive with football. The cafes debated formations and players, and the chances of the host nation the way they had never debated anything before. The final was played on the 30th of July 1930 between Uruguay and Argentina, neighbors, rivals, the 2 dominant footballing nations of South America, before a crowd of approximately 93,000 people. Uruguay won 4-2. The man who scored the first goal in World Cup final history was Pablo Dorado of Uruguay in the 12th minute of the 1930 final. He was a 22-year-old winger from Montevideo who had scored twice in the tournament. He scored, turned, and ran back to the centre circle while the Estadio Centenario erupted around him, and he could not possibly have known that what he had just done would be remembered 90 years later, that the number he wore and the minute he scored in would be recorded and reproduced and referenced in documentaries and history books and YouTube videos made long after his death. He was just a young man who kicked a ball into a net. And in doing so, He became the first person to score a goal in the history of the World Cup. His name was Pablo Dorado. He deserves to be remembered. The first World Cup was a modest affair by the standards of what came later. It had no television, no global audience, no sponsorship deals, no broadcast rights, no player agents or multi-million-pound transfers. It was 13 teams in a small stadium in South America, watched by a relatively small crowd, in a competition that most of the world did not participate in. But it was the beginning, and the beginning of something that becomes the most watched sporting event in human history deserves to be remembered with appropriate reverence. The World Cup was born. The world just did not know it yet. The great early names, the players who lit the way. Before we move on, before we reach the television era and the global superstars and the billion-dollar transfer fees, let us pause for a moment with some of the players who defined the early decades of the game. The men who played without the benefit of footage, whose careers exist mostly in photographs and match reports and the memories of people long since gone, but whose names still mean something to those who love the history of the sport. Arthur Wharton. Born in Ghana in 1865, son of a Ghanaian princess and a Scottish Ghanaian missionary, he arrived in England as a teenager and became, in 1889, the first black professional footballer in the world, playing as goalkeeper for Preston North End, the dominant team of the era. He was also the fastest man in England, holder of the world record for the 100 yards. He died in poverty in 1930, largely forgotten. A statue of him now stands in the National Football Museum in Manchester. Matthias Sindelar. The Austrian forward was called the Paperman for his slender build and extraordinary movement. He seemed to drift past defenders rather than run past them, finding space and angles that no one else could see. He was the greatest European player of the 1930s. He refused to play for Germany after the Anschluss incorporated Austria into the Nazi state. He died in 1939, in circumstances that were officially ruled accidental, but have always been suspected otherwise. Leonidas da Silva. The Brazilian forward at the 1938 World Cup in France was the first superstar of the global game, the first player whose name was known and celebrated across multiple continents, the first to appear in advertising, the first to become what we would now call a celebrity. He scored 7 goals in the tournament, finished as top scorer, and was so confident of Brazil's place in the final that he rested for the semi-final to preserve himself. Brazil lost the semi-final in his absence and were eliminated. He never got to play in the final he had saved himself for. Football has always had this capacity for breaking hearts at the very moment of greatest hope. The first ever hat-trick scored in a World Cup was scored by Guillermo Stabile of Argentina in 1930. 3 goals in a single match against Mexico in the very first World Cup. Stabile had not even been supposed to play in that match. He was a replacement for an injured player, appearing in only his second international. He scored a hat-trick in his first World Cup match, finished as the tournament's top scorer, and then almost never played for Argentina again. His manager did not like him. The player he had replaced returned from injury, and Stabile was dropped. He went on to have a distinguished career as a club manager in Argentina, coaching the national team for a decade, winning South American championships. But the hat-trick in his first World Cup game, the goals that made him the first top scorer in World Cup history, those came from a man who was not even meant to be there. History is full of people who are not meant to be there. That may be the most important thing it teaches us. Football interrupted, the war years, and what survived. The story of football between 1930 and 1950 is inevitably the story of the world between 1930 and 1950. And the world between 1930 and 1950 was not a good place. The 1938 World Cup in France was held in the shadow of a continent already sliding toward catastrophe. Germany had annexed Austria the previous year. Czechoslovakia was under pressure. The Spanish Civil War had just ended. Several nations withdrew from the tournament for political reasons. The final, Italy beating Hungary 4-2, was played in Paris, while the newspapers carried stories that everyone knew were pointing toward something terrible. The 1942 and 1946 World Cups were cancelled. The Second World War consumed the world, and football, like everything else, was swallowed by it. And yet football did not disappear entirely. In England, a wartime league was organised, with players appearing for clubs wherever they happened to be stationed. In Germany, football continued through most of the war years, providing a semblance of normalcy to populations living through anything but. In the prisoner of war camps, in the bombed-out fields, in the brief quiet moments between deployments, men played football because it was something human to do in inhuman circumstances. Let's step back for a moment, more than 2 decades before these events. In December 1914, during the famous Christmas truce on the Western Front of the First World War, German and British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and met in no man's land to exchange gifts and, in several documented instances, to play football in the frozen mud between the lines. The exact details vary. Some accounts describe a formal match, others a loose kickabout. But the essential fact is verified by multiple eyewitness accounts in letters and diaries. Men who had been trying to kill each other the day before and would be trying to kill each other again the next day stood in a field on Christmas morning and played football. It tells you something about what the game was, and perhaps something about what peace is, that this is the thing they chose to do with their extraordinary, temporary, heartbreaking freedom. Back to 1945. The war, that later war, the one that had interrupted 2 World Cups, ended that year. The world began, slowly and painfully, to rebuild. And football, which had been kept alive in fragments, in wartime leagues and garrison matches and prison camp kickabouts, reassembled itself with surprising speed. The 1950 World Cup was held in Brazil. England, who had refused to join FIFA in 1928 and had only rejoined in 1946, entered a World Cup for the first time. They were considered strong favourites. In the first round, they lost to the United States of America, 1-0. The result was so shocking that many newspapers in England assumed it was a misprint when they first received the telegram from Brazil. It was not a misprint. Football had moved on without England. The world was playing. The Maracanazo and the afternoon Brazil wept. The 1950 World Cup final was not called a final. Due to the tournament format, it was the last game of a final round robin. But in practice, it was a final. Brazil versus Uruguay played at the Maracanã Stadium in Rio de Janeiro before a crowd of approximately 200,000 people, the largest attendance at a football match in history. A number that has never been surpassed and never will be. because stadiums are no longer built to hold 200,000 people. Brazil needed only a draw to win the World Cup. Uruguay needed to win. Brazil had beaten Sweden 7-1 and Spain 6-1 in the previous games. The morning newspapers had already printed congratulations to the new world champions. A samba had been composed in honor of the victory. The trophy was engraved in advance. Brazil were leading 1-0 at half-time. With 11 minutes remaining, Uruguay equalized. With minutes remaining, they scored again. Uruguay 2, Brazil 1. The final whistle blew. The 200,000 people in the Maracanã went silent. The silence in that enormous stadium is one of the most described moments in football history. People who were there, and there were 200,000 of them, wrote about it for the rest of their lives. The silence of 200,000 people who had been absolutely certain of something and then had it taken away in 20 minutes. The event became known simply as the Maracanazo, the Maracanã blow. The Uruguayan goalkeeper, Roque Maspoli, who kept a clean sheet in the second half as Uruguay defended their lead, was asked 60 years later what he remembered most about those final minutes. He said, "The silence, not the roar when they scored, not the whistle, the silence afterwards." He said he had never heard anything like it in his life. 200,000 people absolutely quiet. He said it was the most frightening sound he had ever heard. A silence that size, he said, has a weight to it. You can feel it pressing on you. He kept that silence with him for the rest of his life. Brazil would wait 8 years to win a World Cup. When they finally did, in 1958, it would be with a team so gifted, so joyful, so completely unlike anything the world had seen before, that the Maracanazo would finally, at last, be answered. And the answer would come in the form of a 17-year-old boy from a small town in São Paulo state, whose name the world did not yet know. Brazil, 1958, a 17-year-old named Pelé. His full name was Edson Arantes do Nascimento. His father, a professional footballer of modest achievement, called him Pelé, a nickname whose origin Pelé himself always claimed not to understand, saying it was simply a sound that other children at his school used to tease him with, which stuck. He was born in 1940 in the town of Três Corações, 3 Hearts, in the state of Minas Gerais. His family was poor. He shined shoes as a child to help his mother. He practiced football with a grapefruit when he could not afford a ball, with a sock stuffed with newspaper when he could not find a grapefruit. He joined Santos FC at the age of 15. He was called up to the Brazilian national squad at 16. And in 1958, Brazil travelled to Sweden for the World Cup with a 17-year-old in their squad who had never played a full international match. He played his first World Cup game in the quarter-finals against Wales. He scored the only goal of the game, becoming, at 17 years and 249 days, the youngest player ever to score in a World Cup. A record that stands to this day and will almost certainly never be broken. In the semi-final against France, he scored a hat-trick. In the final against Sweden, in Stockholm, in front of 50,000 Swedes who had come to watch their own team win, he scored twice. His second goal, scored with 7 minutes remaining to make it 5-2, is one of the most replayed moments in football history. He received the ball with his back to goal, flicked it over the head of a defender with his chest, turned and volleyed it into the net before it touched the ground. When the final whistle blew, Pelé collapsed on the pitch and wept. His teammates carried him on their shoulders. In the stands, Swedish supporters applauded a Brazilian victory because they had just watched something they understood to be exceptional, and decency required acknowledgement. Pelé scored 1,281 goals in 1,363 official matches over a career that lasted from 1956 to 1977. The number is so large that it is difficult to contextualize. It means that in an average game, across his entire career, Pelé scored approximately 0.94 goals. For 21 years, in almost every game he played, he scored almost exactly one goal. He won 3 World Cups with Brazil in 1958, 1962, and 1970. He is the only player in history to have done so. Multiple foreign governments at war attempted to negotiate ceasefires specifically to watch him play. Nigeria and Biafra, engaged in a brutal civil war in 1967, agreed to a 48-hour ceasefire so that both sides could watch a Santos exhibition match in Lagos. A ceasefire for a football match for one man. Pelé played his last World Cup in Mexico in 1970 at the age of 29 with what many consider the greatest team in the history of the tournament. Brazil 1970, with Pelé, Rivelino, Jairzinho, Tostão, Gerson, Carlos Alberto, played football of such exhilarating, flowing, joyful quality that the final, a 4-1 demolition of Italy, is still used as a reference point for what football can be at its absolute best. Carlos Alberto's 4th goal, a sweeping, perfectly timed, full-pace shot from the right following a move that involved almost every player on the pitch, is regularly voted the greatest goal in World Cup history. It was not a goal that came from nowhere. It was the logical conclusion of an entire tournament's worth of possession and movement and joy. It was football saying, "This is what we are. This is what we can do. Watch." Total football, Cruyff, Ajax, and the Dutch Revolution. While Brazil were redefining what football could look like at its most joyful, a very different kind of revolution was taking place in the unlikely setting of Amsterdam. Ajax, a club from a city better known for its canals and its painters than its football, had been quietly building something extraordinary through the late 1960s under a coach named Rinus Michels. What Michels was building was a system, a way of playing that did not depend on fixed positions, that required every player to be comfortable anywhere on the pitch, that used space and movement and intelligent pressing to create and destroy in equal measure. The Dutch called it totaal voetbal, total football. The idea sounds simple. Every player attacks, every player defends, and when the ball is lost, the entire team presses immediately to win it back. In practice, it required a level of technical ability, tactical understanding, and physical fitness that had never previously been demanded of an entire team simultaneously. Ajax won the European Cup, the forerunner of the Champions League, the competition between the champions of each European nation, 3 times in a row, in 1971, 1972, and 1973. In those 3 years, they did not just win the competition. They changed the way European football understood itself, and at the center of all of it was Johan Cruyff. Cruyff was not the biggest player on the pitch. He was not the fastest or the strongest. What he was simply the most intelligent footballer who had ever played the game, a player who understood space and time on a football pitch in a way that seemed almost theoretical, who moved not to where the ball was but to where it was going to be, who could slow a game down or accelerate it with a single touch, and who could, when the moment demanded it, do things with a football that made the people watching them gasp and then immediately want to see them again. The Cruyff turn is one of the most imitated moves in football history. In the 1974 World Cup, playing for the Netherlands against Sweden, Cruyff received the ball near the touchline with a Swedish defender closing him down fast from behind. Every expectation, every physical logic, every footballing convention said he would cross the ball or play it back. Instead, he dragged it behind his standing leg with the inside of his right foot, pivoted 180 degrees, and was gone, leaving the defender facing the wrong direction, grasping at empty air. The whole movement took perhaps half a second. The defender, Jan Olsson, a perfectly competent Swedish international, later said it was the most humiliating moment of his career. He said that for half a second, Cruyff had made him believe that up was down. The Cruyff turn has been taught in football academies on every continent ever since. It bears his name because no one before him had thought to do it. The Netherlands reached the 1974 World Cup final, playing what many considered the most beautiful football ever seen at a World Cup. They lost to West Germany 2-1 in one of the most debated results in the history of the tournament, a result that is still argued about in Dutch cafes today, 50 years later. The Netherlands were brilliant. They were better. They lost anyway. Football is not always just. This is part of what makes it real. Cruyff retired from playing in 1984. He returned to Ajax as manager and then moved to Barcelona, where he built the foundations of a footballing philosophy: possession, pressing, positional play, the development of young players through a coherent system that would produce, over the following 3 decades, the most successful club team in the history of the sport. He died in 2016. His influence on the game is so pervasive, so thoroughly absorbed into how modern football thinks about itself, that it is almost impossible now to see where it begins and ends. The great club sides: Real Madrid, Liverpool, AC Milan. While the World Cup provided football with its grandest stage, it was the clubs that provided its continuity. The teams that played not once every 4 years but 40 times a season, year after year, decade after decade, accumulating histories and rivalries and traditions that became woven into the fabric of their cities. Let us spend a moment with 3 of the greatest. Real Madrid in the 1950s were simply the most dominant club team the world had ever seen. Under their president, Santiago Bernabeu, a man who had fought in the Spanish Civil War and emerged from it determined to build something that would make the whole world look at Madrid, Real assembled a team of breathtaking quality. Their centerpiece was Alfredo Di Stefano, an Argentine who had somehow ended up in Spain and who was, in the mid-1950s, the best footballer on earth. Around him were Ferenc Puskás, the Hungarian genius who had defected after the Soviet crushing of the 1956 uprising, and Francisco Gento, the Spanish winger who could run faster with the ball than most people could without it. Real Madrid won the European Cup 5 consecutive times between 1956 and 1960, 5 times in a row. No team has matched that record. Their 1960 European Cup final, a 7-3 victory over Eintracht Frankfurt, played at Hampden Park in Glasgow, watched by 127,000 people, is still considered by many who were there to be the finest club performance in the history of the sport. Alfredo Di Stefano is perhaps the most remarkable figure in the history of Real Madrid, which is saying something given what Real Madrid has been. He was born in Argentina, played for Argentina, Colombia, and then Spain at international level, and his career at Real Madrid lasted 11 years, during which he won 5 European Cups and 8 Spanish league titles. He was so committed to winning that his teammates described him as the most demanding presence they had ever encountered. A player who expected everything from everyone, including himself, at all times. He scored in each of Real Madrid's 5 consecutive European Cup finals. When he finally retired in 1966, his manager said, "We will not see his like again." They have not quite. Liverpool Football Club, under Bill Shankly and then Bob Paisley, dominated English and European football in the 1970s and 1980s with a consistency that has never been replicated in the English game. Shankly, a Scottish miner's son, a former player, a man of such passionate intensity that his pre-match team talks were reportedly delivered at a volume that made the walls vibrate, transformed Liverpool from a mediocre second division club into the dominant force in England. But it was what happened after he retired that is perhaps most remarkable. Paisley, his assistant, took over in 1974 and won 6 league titles, 3 European Cups, and 3 League Cups in 9 seasons, the most decorated managerial reign in British football history, achieved by a man who had never intended to be a manager at all. Under Shankly and Paisley, Anfield became something more than a football ground. It became a place with a sound produced by the Kop, the steep standing terrace behind one goal, 40,000 people singing in the Scouse accent of the city, a sound so distinctive and so powerful that visiting teams described it as a physical thing, something that pressed against you as you walked out of the tunnel. You can close your eyes and almost hear it. Football and Politics, Argentina, 1978. Football and politics have always been intertwined. Mussolini used the 1934 World Cup in Italy as a showcase for fascism. The Soviet Union and the United States Cold War was fought in part on football pitches. The 1969 war between Honduras and El Salvador, a brief, brutal conflict, was sparked in part by a World Cup qualifying match and has become known, incorrectly but revealingly, as the Football War. But perhaps no World Cup sits more uncomfortably in the history of the sport than the 1978 tournament in Argentina. The Argentine military junta, which had seized power in a coup in 1976 and was engaged in the systematic murder and disappearance of political opponents, an estimated 30,000 people killed or disappeared in what became known as the Dirty War, hosted the 1978 World Cup under the eyes of the world. The tournament proceeded. The world came to Argentina. The games were played. Argentina won, beating the Netherlands 3-1 in the final in Buenos Aires, after a famously controversial match against Peru, in which Argentina needed to win by 4 goals and won by 6, raising questions that have never been fully answered. The Argentine players celebrated in a stadium filled with ticker tape and joy. A few kilometers from the stadium, in a detention center called ESMA, prisoners were being tortured. Some accounts suggest they could hear the roaring of the crowds. The Dutch captain, Ruud Krol, later said that the Netherlands squad had debated at length whether to boycott the tournament entirely. They decided to play, reasoning that withdrawing would give the junta a propaganda victory. It was an impossible choice, as moral choices in sport so often are. There was no right answer. There was only the match and the stadium and the noise, and outside the stadium, the silence of the disappeared. Football at its most uncomfortable is football being held up to the world it exists within. The 1978 World Cup did not redeem Argentina's government, but the Argentine people who filled those stadiums were not the government. They were people who loved football and who, for those weeks, were allowed to forget. Perhaps they should not have been allowed to forget. Perhaps the forgetting was the point. These are questions that football cannot answer, but that football, at its most honest, insists on asking. The hand of God and the goal of the century. Maradona, 1986. There are football matches that people remember the way they remember certain days in their own lives. Not because they were there, but because the images entered the culture so completely that they became shared memory. The Argentina versus England quarter-final at the 1986 World Cup in Mexico City is one of those matches. The context mattered. 4 years earlier, Argentina and Britain had fought the Falklands War, a brief, bitter conflict over a group of islands in the South Atlantic that left several hundred people dead on both sides and a wound in the relationship between the two countries that had not healed. Now, in the sweltering heat of the Estadio Azteca, they were playing football. Diego Maradona was 25 years old. He was already, by general consensus, the best footballer in the world, a player of extraordinary technical gifts, compact and powerful and low to the ground, almost impossible to knock off the ball, with a left foot that could do things that seemed to require more than the usual number of joints. He had come from the Villa Fiorito shantytown in Buenos Aires. He had played on the Potrero. He had learned the game with his body close to the ground, the ball always close to his feet, in spaces too small for most players to operate. In the 51st minute of the quarter-final, Maradona scored with his hand. A high ball bounced in the penalty area. Maradona jumped for it, and his left hand, clearly, visibly, undeniably, punched it into the net. The English players appealed. The referee, Ali bin Nasser of Tunisia, had not seen it. He gave the goal. Maradona celebrated. He looked at his teammates. He was not certain the goal would stand, and then it stood. Afterwards, he said that the goal had been scored a little with the head of Maradona and a little with the hand of God. The phrase, cynical, brilliant, defiant, funny, became one of the most famous sentences in the history of sport. 4 minutes after the hand of God, Maradona scored what FIFA has voted the goal of the century. He received the ball in his own half, 60 metres from the English goal, and ran. He ran past Peter Reid. He ran past Terry Butcher. He ran past Terry Fenwick. He ran past Terry Butcher again, who had recovered and come back to try to stop him. He rounded the goalkeeper Peter Shilton and rolled the ball into the net. 6 England players, 60 metres, 11 seconds. The entire English defence, one of the best in world football, dismantled by a single human being running with a ball at his feet. The BBC commentator Barry Davies said, as Maradona ran toward goal, "You have to say, that is magnificent." It was the most restrained possible response to what was happening. When Maradona was asked about that goal 20 years later, he said, "When I'm asked which was the best goal I scored, I say the second one against England. He did not mean the hand of God. He meant the one where he ran. Argentina won the match 2-1. They went on to win the 1986 World Cup, beating West Germany 3-2 in the final. Maradona lifted the trophy in Mexico City, his dark curly hair damp with sweat, his eyes bright, surrounded by his teammates. He was 25 years old. He had, in the space of 4 minutes in a quarter-final against England, scored the most controversial goal and the greatest goal in the history of the World Cup. No one has managed both at once since. No one may ever again. Italia 90, the tournament that broke hearts and changed everything. The 1990 World Cup in Italy is one of the most argued about tournaments in the history of the sport. It was, statistically, the least attacking World Cup ever held, an average of 2.21 goals per game, the lowest on record. It produced some of the most negative, defensive, tactically timid football the tournament had ever seen. Teams played to avoid losing rather than to win. The knockout rounds were dominated by tight, nervous matches that frequently went to penalties. And yet, Italia 90 is also one of the most emotionally remembered tournaments in history. The music helped. Nessun Dorma, the Puccini aria, used as the BBC's theme for their coverage, became forever associated with that summer and played whenever football tried to describe itself as something larger than sport. The moments were extraordinary, even when the football was not. Roger Miller of Cameroon, 38 years old, coming off the bench to score and celebrate by dancing around the corner flag. His joy so unself-conscious and complete that it felt like a rebuke to everyone who had ever played the game with calculation rather than love. Salvatore Schillaci of Italy, a small Sicilian striker no one had expected much from, finishing as the tournament's top scorer with a look of disbelieving joy on his face after every goal, as if he could not quite believe he was there. The semi-finals between England and West Germany, and Italy and Argentina, both ending in penalty shootouts, both producing tears that the cameras found with uncomfortable precision and broadcast to the world. England's Paul Gascoigne, 23 years old, the most naturally gifted English player of his generation, a man of enormous talent and considerable vulnerability in roughly equal measure, received a yellow card in the semi-final against West Germany that meant that if England reached the final, he would be suspended and would miss it. The moment he realized this, his face crumpled. He was playing in a World Cup semi-final on a stage he had spent his entire life working toward, and he started to cry. On the pitch, in front of millions of people, in the middle of the match. His captain Gary Lineker saw it and mouthed to the bench, "Have a word with him." Gascoigne's tears became the image of Italia 90, the image of all the feeling that football produces, the vulnerability of caring about something this much, the absolute exposure of the human heart that the game demands and then displays without mercy. England lost on penalties. Gascoigne never played in a World Cup final. The moment passed and did not come again. Some moments are like that. The window opens and closes, and you are left with what you had, which was almost enough, which is the story of many lives and many footballers, and perhaps most things we love. West Germany won Italia 90, beating Argentina 1-0 in the final through an Andreas Bremer penalty in the 85th minute. It was not a good final. It was a fitting end to a tournament that had been many things: thrilling, exhausting, beautiful, frustrating, heartbreaking, and completely, totally unforgettable. That is what the World Cup does at its best. Not always beautiful, not always just, but always felt. The Premier League revolution, 1992, and the transformation of football. The England of the late 1980s and early 1990s had a football problem. The game was in crisis. Hooliganism had been a plague throughout the 1980s. Violent confrontations between supporters at and around matches that had killed people, destroyed reputations, and led to English clubs being banned from European competition for 5 years following the Heysel Stadium disaster of 1985, in which 39 people died in crowd violence before the European Cup final in Brussels. Then came Hillsborough, the 15th of April 1989, an FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest at Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield. A catastrophic failure of crowd management led to a crush in the Liverpool end. 97 Liverpool supporters died. They had gone to watch a football match, and they did not come home. The Taylor Report, commissioned in the aftermath of Hillsborough, concluded that English football grounds were dangerous and inadequate. It recommended all-seater stadiums, and it created the conditions for a complete reimagining of the top tier of English football. In 1992, the First Division clubs broke away from the Football League to form the Premier League, a new competition with its own commercial structure, its own television deal, and its own ambitions. The television deal it signed with Sky B, the satellite broadcaster that Rupert Murdoch had built, was worth £304 million over 5 years. It was more money than English football had ever seen. The stadiums were rebuilt, the players became celebrities, the game became a global product. The first ever Premier League goal was scored by Brian Deane of Sheffield United against Manchester United on the 15th of August 1992, 5 minutes into the first game of the new competition. Deane was a tall centre-forward, not particularly celebrated, not a household name outside Yorkshire. He controlled a long ball, held off a defender, and headed it into the net. It is a perfectly competent goal, unremarkable by any objective standard, and it has been watched millions of times on YouTube because of what it represents rather than what it is. The first goal of an era. Brian Deane scored it and moved on. 20 years later, a journalist tracked him down and asked him what he remembered about that moment. He said he remembered thinking that he hoped they would win the match. They won 2-1. History, as always, happened to someone who was just trying to do their job. The Premier League became, within a decade, the most watched domestic football league in the world. Its matches were broadcast in over 180 countries. Manchester United, under Alex Ferguson, won the league 13 times in its first 21 seasons. A dominance so complete and so consistent that it reshaped entirely what English football's centre of gravity looked like. Arsenal, under Arsène Wenger, played football of such elegant, precise, flowing quality in their 2003 to 2004 season that they went the entire league campaign unbeaten, 49 games across 2 seasons, and became known as the Invincibles, a name that tells you exactly what they were. The money changed everything. It bought better players, better facilities, better coaching. It also bought excess, wage structures that bore no relationship to anything outside football, transfer fees that grew from millions to tens of millions to hundreds of millions in the space of 2 decades, a gap between the richest clubs and the poorest that widened every year. Football had always been the working man's game. In the Premier League era, It increasingly became something the working man could watch but could no longer afford to attend. The terraces where the songs had come from were replaced by seats. The seats were priced for a different class of supporter. The songs remained. The game never quite lost its voice. But the conditions that had produced those songs were quietly being dismantled. This is the tension at the heart of modern football. It has never been resolved. It probably never will be. Champions League nights, the new cathedrals. While the Premier League was transforming English football, the European Cup was being transformed too. In 1992, the same year the Premier League was founded, as if the sport had decided to reinvent itself completely in a single year. The European Cup became the UEFA Champions League. The format changed, the anthem changed, the name changed, and the scale of what it became was something that the competition's founders in 1955 could not have imagined. The Champions League anthem, that opening fanfare of brass and choir, composed by Tony Britton using a theme from Handel, became one of the most recognized pieces of music in the world. More people have heard it than have heard most symphonies. It plays when the players walk out onto the pitch before every Champions League match, and the effect, reliably, is a particular kind of stillness in the stadium. A collective pause before the noise begins. An acknowledgement that something is about to happen that matters beyond the ordinary. The great Champions League nights have their own texture, something distinct from league football, something slightly larger. Anfield, under the floodlights on a European night, the cop singing, the opposing goalkeeper discovering that the noise can be felt in the chest. The Camp Nou, in Barcelona, 100,000 people in an amphitheatre of noise, when the crowd and the game achieve a kind of synchrony. The San Siro in Milan, the Bernabeu in Madrid, the Westfalenstadion in Dortmund, on a night when the yellow wall, the stand-in terrace that holds 25,000 people, the largest in European football, is moving like a single organism. The 1999 Champions League final, Manchester United versus Bayern Munich in the Nou Camp in Barcelona, is one of the most replayed and retold matches in football history. Manchester United were losing 1-0 with 90 minutes played. The Bayern Munich substitutes had already collected their runners-up medals. United's manager Alex Ferguson had already composed what he intended to say in the post-match press conference. And then, in injury time, United scored. And then, in the second minute of injury time, they scored again. The match ended 2-1. The Bayern Munich players who had collected their medals had to hand them back. Ferguson later said that in those 2 minutes he felt every emotion available to a human being simultaneously, in an order he could not afterwards reconstruct. The goals were scored by Teddy Sheringham and Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, both substitutes, both sent on by Ferguson in the second half, specifically to change the game. Solskjaer has managed Manchester United since. Sheringham became a television pundit. The Nou Camp has hosted many finals. None of them will ever be that final. Real Madrid have won the Champions League 14 times, more than any other club. Their victories in 2016, 2017, and 2018, 3 consecutive titles, match the achievement of their predecessors in the 1950s. Managed by Zinedine Zidane, himself a former player of such extraordinary grace that his career deserves its own chapter. They simply refused to lose the matches that mattered most, a quality that is harder to explain in tactical terms than it is to observe in practice. The Champions League gave football a stage on which the best players in the world could measure themselves against each other every week, not once every 4 years. It created rivalries between clubs from different countries, between cities that had never previously had any sporting relationship. It made the game genuinely, inescapably global in a way that even the World Cup, with its 4-year wait, could not quite achieve. Tuesday and Wednesday nights in autumn and spring, the anthem, the floodlights, the grass that particular shade of green under the lights, the crowd finding its voice in the first few minutes, the way crowds do when they understand that what is about to happen is worth the full extent of their attention. Football gave us this. After everything, after the hooliganism and the disasters and the corruption and the excess, it gave us this. Ronaldo and Messi, the debate that defined a generation. There is a question that has occupied the minds of football supporters for approximately 15 years. In cafes and stadiums and living rooms and offices and school playgrounds on every continent where the game is played. It is a question that admits of no definitive answer, that has been approached from every conceivable angle, that has generated more words and more heat and more quiet, sustained passion than perhaps any other question in the history of sport. Who is better, Cristiano Ronaldo or Lionel Messi? To reduce either of them to a side in a debate is, in a sense, to do them a disservice. They are both extraordinary in ways that deserve to be described on their own terms, without reference to each other. Cristiano Ronaldo was born in Madeira in 1985, the son of a gardener and a cook. He was thin and slight as a teenager, and he worked, the word is not adequate but no other word applies, with a ferocity and a discipline that transformed a gifted youth player into something close to a physical ideal. He trained longer than everyone else. He practiced set pieces until they became reflexes. He built his body into an instrument of extraordinary power and precision. He scored goals from distance, from headers, from free kicks, from impossible angles, in quantities that no player in the history of the game had previously achieved. He won 5 Ballon d'Or awards, the prize given each year to the world's best player. He scored more international goals than any player in history. He did everything through an act of will so evident and so relentless that watching him was sometimes less like watching a footballer than watching a person decide repeatedly that the ordinary laws of difficulty did not apply to him. Lionel Messi was born in Rosario, Argentina in 1987. He was small, genuinely small, not Premier League small, but small in the way that made people question when he arrived at Barcelona's La Masia Academy at 13, whether he could physically survive professional football. He was diagnosed with a growth hormone deficiency as a child and required nightly injections. Barcelona agreed to pay for his medical treatment in exchange for his commitment to the club. He committed. He grew. And what emerged from La Masia was the closest thing to a perfect footballer that the game has produced. Where Ronaldo achieved through will, Messi achieved through what felt from the outside like effortlessness. Though no one who has spoken to his teammates and coaches believes for a moment that it was effortless. It was simply that the effort was invisible. He moved through defences the way water moves through gaps, not by force but by finding the space that was always there, if you could see it. His dribbling was not the dribbling of a man running at defenders, but of a man running around them before they knew he was there. Between 2009 and 2022, Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo won every Ballon d'Or award, every single one, for 13 consecutive years. No other player won it during that span. The two of them divided between them, completely and exhaustively, an award given to the best footballer in the world for more than a decade. In the same period, Messi won 4 Champions League titles with Barcelona, and Ronaldo won 4 with Manchester United and Real Madrid. They were rivals at club level, rivals at international level, rivals for the award, rivals in the imagination of every football supporter on earth. And yet they were never directly competing teammates, never directly competing opponents in a final that would definitively settle the question. The debate remained open because the game never provided the closing argument. Perhaps it never intended to. Perhaps the debate itself, unresolved, ongoing, passionate, was the gift. The question of who is better has never been settled and very probably never will be. What is settled, what seems beyond serious dispute, is that these two men dominated the sport simultaneously for 15 years at a level that made every other footballer who played during that period the third best player in the world. That has never happened before in any sport. That two people of such different gifts could coexist at such a peak for so long, pushing each other to achievements that neither might have reached alone. That is one of the great gifts that sport has given the world in our lifetime. Messi won the World Cup with Argentina in Qatar in 2022 at the age of 35. His final international tournament, his last attempt at the one title that had eluded him throughout his entire career. Argentina beat France in one of the greatest finals in the history of the tournament, 3-3 after extra time, won on penalties. Messi scored twice. When the final whistle blew on the penalty shootout, when it was confirmed that Argentina had won, he dropped to his knees on the pitch in Lusail and was immediately surrounded by his teammates. The image of that moment, of a man who had given the game everything it was possible to give, finally receiving the one thing it had withheld, is one of the defining images of the sport's history. Some things are worth waiting for. The tactical revolution, how the game learned to think. Football in the 1990s and early 2000s was, tactically, a world of 4-4-2. 2 banks of 4, a striker partnership. It was not especially elegant, but it was clear. Everyone knew where they stood, literally. The shape was legible. The roles were defined. Defenders defended, midfielders linked, strikers scored. Then it all changed. The catalyst, arguably, was a team from the north of Spain that had never been the richest club in the world, but had decided, under Cruyff's influence as manager in the late 1980s, to be the most intelligent. Barcelona's La Masia Academy was producing technically exceptional players who thought about the game rather than just playing it. And when Pep Guardiola, a midfielder of modest physical gifts but extraordinary footballing intelligence, a product of La Masia himself, became Barcelona's manager in 2008, he synthesized everything that Cruyff and the club's philosophy had been pointing toward into a system that changed the game completely. Tiki-taka, the name given by the Spanish press to Barcelona's passing style, was not just a style. It was a philosophy. The idea was simple and radical. If we have the ball, the other team cannot score. Therefore, keep the ball. Not defensively, not to run down the clock, but aggressively, using possession as a weapon, pressing immediately when the ball was lost to win it back in dangerous positions, circulating the ball quickly and precisely in tight spaces to to tire and disorient the opposition until the gap appeared. The 2009 Champions League final, Barcelona versus Manchester United in Rome, ended 2-0 to Barcelona and was described by many present as the most complete team performance in the history of the competition. United, under Ferguson, were the defending champions, one of the finest club sides in Europe. They barely touched the ball. Barcelona's possession statistics for the match were in the mid-70s%. Ferguson, who had spent 40 years in football and had seen almost everything, said afterwards that he had never seen a team play like that he had never in his career encountered a side against which he had so few answers. The compliment was so clearly genuine from a man not given to generosity toward opponents that it carried a particular weight. Football had reached a new level of sophistication. Some of the old ways were not going to work anymore. After tiki-taka came gegenpressing, the high-intensity pressing system developed in Germany, most brilliantly expressed by Jurgen Klopp at Borussia Dortmund and then Liverpool, which turned the act of losing the ball into an attacking opportunity by immediately swarming the opponent with pressure. After gegenpressing came positional play, the even more sophisticated system that Guardiola continued to develop at Bayern Munich and Manchester City, using the geometry of the pitch itself as a weapon. The game became, in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, more tactically complex than it had ever been. The data revolution arrived, clubs employing analysts, statisticians, mathematicians, building models of player performance that would have seemed like science fiction to Bill Shankly. Every touch, every run, every defensive action recorded and measured and interpreted and argued over. And yet, despite all of this, the game remained what it had always been. 11 people against 11 people, a ball and a goal at each end. The beautiful uncertainty, the fact that anything can happen, the fact that the smaller team sometimes wins. That has not changed. That will not change. The women's game, from the band years to the World Cup. There is a chapter of football history that is almost never told when the history of the sport is recounted, and it begins with a scandal. Women's football in England in the early 20th century was extraordinarily popular. The women's game had begun during the First World War, when women working in munitions factories formed teams to play at half-time at men's matches and raise money for charity. The matches grew. The audiences grew. A Boxing Day match in 1920 between Dick Kerr Ladies and St Helens Ladies at Goodson Park in Liverpool drew a crowd of 53,000 people, with an estimated 14,000 locked outside, unable to get in. 53,000 people to watch a women's football match in 1920. The Football Association, watching this phenomenon with what can only be described as alarm, issued a ban in 1921. The grounds associated with the FA, the grounds of every professional men's club, were closed to women's football. The official justification was that the game was quite unsuitable for females. The real justification, which several historians have argued convincingly, was that women's football had become too popular and was beginning to threaten the dominance of the men's game. The ban lasted 50 years. 50 years. It was not lifted until 1971. Lily Parr played for Dick Kerr Ladies from 1919, when she was 14 years old, until 1951. She is widely considered the greatest women's footballer of the first half of the 20th century. A left winger of extraordinary power whose shot was so strong that a male professional goalkeeper who agreed to face her in a charity exhibition reportedly had his arm broken by one of her efforts. She scored nearly 1,000 goals in her career, a career that took place entirely in the amateur, unofficial, financially unrewarded world that the FA's ban had created, a world in which the women played because they loved the game and for no other reason. She was inducted into the National Football Museum's Hall of Fame in 2002, the first woman to receive the honour. Her statue stands outside the museum in Manchester. She played for 32 years and most people had never heard her name. That is changing. After the ban was lifted in 1971, the women's game rebuilt itself slowly, without resources, without the financial infrastructure that men's football took for granted. The first Women's World Cup was held in China in 1991, 70 years after the FA's ban, and 61 years after the first Men's World Cup in Uruguay. The United States won it, and would go on to become the dominant force in women's football for the following 3 decades. A dominance rooted in the Title IX legislation of 1972, which required US universities to offer equal sporting opportunities for women and produced generations of technically excellent players with a competitive confidence that the rest of the world struggled to match. The transformation of the women's game in the last 2 decades has been extraordinary. The 2019 Women's World Cup in France drew television audiences in the hundreds of millions. The 2023 Women's World Cup in Australia and New Zealand set new records. The opening match drew nearly 80,000 fans to Stadium Australia in Sydney. The women who play football today, Alexia Putellas, Sam Kerr, Alex Morgan, Vivianne Miedema, Ada Hegerberg, are complete footballers in every sense, players of technique and athleticism and tactical sophistication that would have seemed impossible to those Dick Kerr ladies playing on borrowed grounds in 1920. They are the heirs of women who played for love alone, who were banned, who kept playing anyway. The game owes them everything, and for a long time gave them almost nothing. That is changing too. Football and identity. What clubs mean. A club is not a company. A club is not a brand. These are things that football clubs have become in some cases in the modern era, but they are not what a club is. A club is a community that has decided to have a team. The decision usually happened a long time ago. A church social club, a group of factory workers, a pub team that started playing organised matches, a school that let their former pupils keep using the ground. The decision happened before the money came, before the television deals, before the transfer fees, before any of the things that make modern football what it is. The decision happened when it was just a game and someone thought it would be good to play it together on a regular basis. That original decision is still there, somewhere inside every club. You can find it in the old photographs in the clubhouse, the team in sepia, the shirts not quite matching, the ground barely distinguishable from a field. You can find it in the names of the streets around the stadium, named after former players or former directors in the decades when those names meant something to the neighbourhood. You can find it in the songs that were written by supporters who had no expectation of being heard beyond the terrace, who were singing because the game demanded an expression of what they felt, and the voice was the only instrument they had. Borussia Dortmund Stadium is called the Signal Iduna Park by its sponsor, and the Westfalenstadion by almost everyone who uses it. The Yellow Wall, the Südtribüne, the South Standing Terrace, holds 25,000 people, all standing, all in yellow and black, all close together on a steep rake that puts them almost directly above the pitch. When the yellow wall is full and the match is at a moment of intensity, the noise and movement it produces is unlike anything else in European football. Players who have played at the Bernabeu and the Camp Nou and Anfield describe the Westfalenstadion as something different, something more physical. A Colombian player who signed for Dortmund described his first experience of it in an interview. He said that when the yellow wall began to sing, he felt it in his ribcage, not metaphorically, literally. The vibration of 25,000 voices in an enclosed space, reaching across the pitch and into his chest. He said he had never felt anything like it in football. He said it made him understand, for the first time, what playing for a club meant, not to the people in the boardroom or in the television studios, but to the people in the yellow and black who were singing from their chests at full volume, because this team, this specific team from this specific city, was the team they had chosen to love with everything they had. That is what football is. That is what it has always been. The great World Cup moments from Zidane to Qatar. The World Cup in the modern era has produced moments that belong to everyone, images and instants that entered the shared memory of the sport in real time, watched by hundreds of millions of people simultaneously. France, 1998, the host nation in the final against Brazil, the defending champions. Zinedine Zidane, the son of Algerian immigrants born in Marseille, the midfield genius of his generation, scoring twice in the first half with headers, a type of goal entirely uncharacteristic of a player whose gifts were of touch and vision and movement rather than physical power. France won 3-0. The Champs-Élysées that night, hundreds of thousands of people of every background celebrating together, the tricolour and the Algerian flag side by side, Paris belonging to itself in the best way, is one of the great images of the 1990s. Germany, 2006. The tournament called the Summer Fairy Tale in Germany, a country that hosted a World Cup and discovered, to its own somewhat surprised pleasure, that it could be joyful and open and welcoming, that the world could come to Germany and Germany could be glad to have it. The matches were excellent. The atmosphere was extraordinary. And then, in the final between France and Italy, Zinedine Zidane, in the last match of his career, seconds from the greatest possible farewell, head-butted an Italian defender in the chest and was sent off. He walked past the World Cup trophy on his way to the tunnel. He did not look at it. Brazil 2014. The host nation's semi-final against Germany at the Estadio Mineirão in Belo Horizonte. Germany won 7-1, 7-1, against Brazil, in Brazil. The ground fell silent after the fourth German goal, with 30 minutes still to play. Brazilian supporters were filmed weeping in the stands, not in the way supporters weep when their team loses a close match, the tears of disappointment, but in the way people weep when something they love has been broken in front of them. The match became known in Brazil as the Mineirazo, echoing the Maracanazo of 1950, the national trauma that Brazil had believed it had finally healed. The 2022 World Cup final in Qatar, Argentina versus France, produced what many consider the greatest final in the history of the tournament. Argentina led 2-0 with 10 minutes to play. France scored twice in 90 seconds through Kylian Mbappé to level at 2-2. The match went to extra time. Messi scored to make it 3-2. Mbappé scored again to make it 3-3, completing a hat-trick, the second hat-trick in a World Cup final in history. Argentina won on penalties. Mbappé ended the tournament as top scorer. He was 23 years old. He had scored a hat-trick in a World Cup final and finished on the losing side. Every generation of football produces someone who makes you understand that the previous generation's definition of extraordinary was not wide enough. Mbappé is that person for this generation. Whatever comes next, it will involve him. What football is: a quiet reflection. We have been traveling a long time, from the silk courts of ancient China to the frozen mud of Flanders, from the cobbled streets of Victorian Sheffield to the Estadio Centenario in Montevideo, from a 17-year-old weeping on a pitch in Stockholm to a 35-year-old weeping on a pitch in Lusail, from the band women playing on borrowed grounds in Lancashire to a crowd of 80,000 in Sydney, from the Yellow Wall to the Cop, to the Camp Nou, to the Maracana, to a street in Buenos Aires, where boys are still playing on a piece of ground too small for anything but brilliance. We should try, before we finish, to say something true about what football is. It is a game. It is only a game. This needs to be said occasionally, firmly, because football is sometimes treated with a solemnity that it cannot bear and does not deserve. It is a game played with a ball on a field. It does not cure disease. It does not resolve injustice. It does not feed the hungry or house the homeless or make the world more equal. In the years that the World Cup has been held, the world has remained largely indifferent to these requirements, and yet, football is one of the few activities that human beings have invented that can be played at the highest level by people from any country, any background, any economic circumstance. The most expensive piece of equipment it requires is boots. In many places, it requires nothing at all. The potreros of Buenos Aires, the streets of Lagos, the dirt pitches of Kinshasa and Dakar and Dhaka, the school playgrounds of Manchester and Madrid and Mexico City. Everywhere the game has gone, and it has gone everywhere, children have found a piece of ground and a ball and other children and started playing. That universality is not an accident. It is the deepest thing about the game. Football is what it looks like when human beings' need for play, for contest, for community, for beauty, for the expression of physical joy finds its most accessible form. There is a statistic that is often quoted about football, but that bears repeating because it is genuinely astonishing. The 2022 World Cup final between Argentina and France was watched by approximately 1 billion people simultaneously. 1 billion. 1 in 8 of every human being alive on Earth watched the same 90 minutes of football at the same time. They watched in living rooms in rural China and in bars in Buenos Aires and in offices in Lagos and on phones on trains in Tokyo and on large screens in public squares in Paris. They spoke different languages, lived under different governments, ate different food, held different beliefs. They were watching the same thing. There are not many things in human experience that can claim that. There are not many things that 1 in 8 human beings do simultaneously, voluntarily, for the same reason, at the same time. Football is one of them, perhaps the only one. What football is, finally, is this. It is the thing that 2 boys kicking a ball in an alley share with 1 billion people watching a World Cup final. It is the thread that connects the woman playing cuju in a Tang Dynasty palace garden with the girl playing in a park in Sydney 2,000 years later. It is the language that needs no translation, the same rules, the same ball, the same goal, the same joy when it goes in, the same grief when it doesn't. It is the game that banned women and then could not keep them out. The game that crossed oceans on ships and found communities that loved it more than the people who carried it. The game that produced Pelé and Cruyff and Maradona and Messi and will produce someone we haven't heard of yet in a city we might not expect, playing on a piece of ground just big enough for something extraordinary to begin. It is the game we are still falling in love with. Every generation, for as long as there have been people who played it, has felt that it belongs to them, that it is the game of their time, their city, their street, their people. Every generation has been right. And so, fellow traveller, our journey reaches its end. We have travelled from the ancient fields of China to the great stadiums of the modern world. We have crossed medieval streets, industrial towns, distant ports, and crowded terraces. We have witnessed football become organised, professional, international, and finally universal. We have met players who seem to move beyond the limits of the game. We have remembered victories that united nations and defeats that left entire generations heartbroken. We have seen football used as celebration, protest, business, identity, and escape. And through every century, every change, and every controversy, something simple has remained: a ball, a space in which to play, and the hope that, for one brief moment, something extraordinary might happen. Perhaps that is why football has endured, because beneath the money, the fame, and the enormous stadiums, it still belongs to everyone. To the child playing alone against a wall, to the friends using jackets as goalposts, to the supporters who travel across countries, to the communities that see themselves reflected in the colours of a club. Football is only a game, and yet somehow it has never been only a game. We hope this journey brought you somewhere good. We hope it brought you a little of what football, at its best, has always offered. The feeling that the world is vast and complicated, yet still capable of gathering around one shared moment. If you've enjoyed this gentle journey through history, we would truly love to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're listening from. It is always wonderful to imagine these stories reaching fellow travelers across different countries, cultures, and time zones. Thank you for traveling through history with us. Until our paths cross again, take care, rest well, and keep listening for the stories that still echo across time.